Hello, my name is Walter Goodfield, VP at RKL Solutions, and welcome to our podcast playback regarding 2017 year-end HR planning, along with 2018 preparations. Joining us as speaker today is Danielle Hoffer, Practice Leader for HR Consulting at RKL. Danielle is going to walk us through 2017 year-end closing advice and important 2018 updates, including compliance and reporting changes. Thanks for joining us today, Danielle, and take it away.
Thanks, Walt. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk to everyone and share this information. There's a lot of things that happen in HR, and the things that we're going to talk about are, while fairly brief in nature, can be very impactful. With no further delay, I do want to talk a little bit about some things that are going to happen yet toward the end of the year. We're almost there, but there's some really beneficial topics to talk about to kind of get in front of and to provide some employee morale benefit. So we're going to talk about some things you can do with your Section 125 plan, and if you're not sure what a Section 125 plan is, we'll talk about that. The time off benefits that all employees really want and need, and some things to just consider as we're going into the new year and planning. Affordable Care Act reporting and some things to be in front of and make sure you're preparing for. Talk about HR metrics and how to pull some analyses together to lay a new baseline for what's happening in 2018 and maybe what's happened in 2017 in HR. We're also going to talk about some things, as we're wrapping up an existing year, really looking at what can HR do from preparation for 2018 and kind of starting to get in front of what's happening within your organization. So we're going to talk about some compliance review things. They always exist, they'll always exist. But what can we do and some things to look at there? And then some general HR strategy topics that I think are really important as we go into the next year to consider. And then lastly, 2018 reminders for anybody who is not aware and has to report. There's been some changes to the EEO-1 reporting, so we want to make sure that you're fully aware of those changes, how they impact you, and what companies are impacted and are required to do EEO reporting in the event you do not already know. So with no further delay, year-end 2017, we are very close to that being completed, yet not there quite yet. So Section 125, if this doesn't sound familiar to you, it's your cafeteria plan, basically your flex spending accounts. Most of these plans, and we're particularly talking about limited purpose and regular flex spending accounts, not dependent daycare accounts. These are really designed a calendar year. They're use it or lose it in nature. Some of the benefits of the use it or lose it plan, and those are, by the way, IRS rules, not HR rules, for those of you who didn't know. But the idea behind this is employees get the opportunity through the course of the year to have a certain amount of money deducted from their paycheck with the ability to use it at any time during that year. So if somebody has a medical need in January, they can use all of those funds in January with the expectation that they would pay their account back through the year. Use it or lose it because it's a pre-tax benefit and because it's designated in that time period. Now, there are a couple of things to consider. Plans renew 1/1. Some FSAs run fiscal year, but most of them run calendar year. So as you're looking to renew, there's a couple of things you should consider relative to your FSA plan and the way it's designed. There's something called a grace period. The grace period basically gives employees through March to be able to submit receipts for their 2017 claims. There's also a run-out period, which gives employees the opportunity to run out their money essentially through first quarter following year. Their 2018 funds would not become available to them until they exhausted their 2017 funds. The reason I mention all of this is it's a critical time to do reminders. Something like a flex spending account gives employees a lot of versatility to be able to manage their own personal health care. The issue is a lot of employees neglect to be able to keep in front of this stuff, And at this point, some of them may really not have any idea how many funds are left in their account, if they've provided all of the necessary receipts to substantiate those deductions from their account for medical, dental, vision, et cetera purposes. It's a great time right now to be pulling reports, to be notifying individuals of what monies are left, particularly if you have a run-out period so that they know they need to utilize those funds. It's also a great time to be reminding people if they have outstanding claims that need to be substantiated by providing receipts. There's a couple benefits to this. One is it's a great employee morale issue. It's not going to be a morale that you're giving them the information, but it's definitely going to be a negative morale thing if they do have monies that are left unused and you have to deduct it from their paycheck to repay the company for monies that they were not eligible to use and did use. Secondly, that's a lot of extra effort for HR and for payroll to go through refunding all of those receipts that may or may not have been utilized appropriately and are owed back to the company. So for a benefit that's really truly intended to be a benefit and provide flexibility, it's really not a great place for an organization to be in on the backside to have to refund it and tell people that they lose their monies if they haven't used it. So I really recommend looking at your plan, understanding the way that it's designed. Do you have a grace period? Do you have a run-out period? What are those deadlines? Pulling reporting, whether you have access to it or you can leverage your benefit broker or your third-party administrator, but start pulling that information and start sending reminders so folks have the opportunity to get in front of that. Again, it's a much more positive morale scenario. There is individual accountability in it, but again, it's pretty easy, particularly if you had doctor's appointments earlier in the year, to kind of get lost in forgetting to provide the appropriate receipts. So I also want to talk about time off benefits. So, you know, PTO, vacation, sick, however you define them in your organization. Again, it's really beneficial from a reminder perspective to, for yourself as much as anything, to start preparing for updating leave banks, what folks have access to communicate in the event that they have exceeded a leave, PTO, vacation, et cetera. If you have a policy where you allow people to borrow from the following year, so if they can borrow time from 18, to give them the expectation of what's now available to them. So making sure you're updating that in the event that you have carryover leave, that folks, again, understand what their allotment is, and if they have carryover, what the rules are around whether they have to utilize it first and by any specific time frame. And again, a lot of these things sound pretty standard, but I think, again, there's a lot of rules, and often people kind of neglect to pay some attention to this. And then, again, if you have any request deadlines, there are certainly companies that by February, any full weeks of vacation need to be submitted and approved. So whatever those rules might be relative to leave, just kind of putting out reminders relative to that to employees so that they can adhere accordingly to those rules. With that said, a lot of times employees like to understand what holidays look like, so this is a great time of year to start putting out the holiday calendar for the following year. And while this seems pretty basic, it can be fairly complex. You know, last year, holidays were over the weekend, so it made it a little bit easier with, you know, if the holiday falls on a Sunday, then we'll have off Monday. This year, it's on a Monday, so it's pretty straightforward. You know, next year, as we look toward holidays being toward the middle of the week and not surrounding a weekend, providing clarity on how that impacts your organization so that, again, employees have lead time relative to requesting time off, understanding production requirements. Those things are very helpful. Communicate and publish in very public areas as soon as you can get that information. It's not only good for employees, but as payroll is starting to create the payroll files for the following year, having the information in the system is very helpful. The other thing from a time off benefits perspective is, depending on how you handle your FMLA, some while most companies actually have it on a rolling 12-month, there are companies that have calendar year FMLA. It's going to be important to sit down and look at your documentation review, make sure that you have all of your FMLA forms completed, your tracking is up to date of time off for both intermittent and regular FMLA leaves, that the information that you have provided to employees is complete. If you need additional medical certifications as part of your FMLA process for any individuals, that you put those requests out. From a renewal perspective, if there's employees that, again, have intermittent leaves and you're on their annual renewal, that you focus on that. I would also suggest, if you don't have an FMLA IT tool that helps you track all of it, that you make sure that your Excel spreadsheet is up to date, again, not just with the total accruals, but any upcoming deadlines that you need to be able to manage too. Stuff like that's pretty easy to get away from, and there are a lot of employers that have contagious issues that happen in FMLA, and particularly around intermittent leaves, and it can be very complex. So as we're winding down the 2017 open enrollment and all the variety of things that happen in fourth quarter for HR, it's a good time to just kind of clean some of that up a little bit. So I would also want to talk about ACA reporting. So for all those calendar year benefit renewals for your medical, ACA reporting deadlines are coming up. So the past couple years, there have been extensions on the deadlines to file your 1094s and 1095s. There's been no extension this year, so you should be prepared to file your 1094s and 1095s by the January 31st, 2018 deadline. So relative to these documents are a couple things. One, size of employer. So you should have 50 or more employees, unless you're a self-insured plan with under 50 employees. Then there's different forms, 1095 and 1094, there's different forms. Certainly your broker can help you with this. From an eligibility perspective from employee and company, the key components of this are, again, making sure you're managing eligibility. When did somebody become eligible? If they were eligible, did they waive? When did they take benefits? There's codes that go along with all of that, but you need to make sure that you're tracking this on a monthly basis so that you can report effectively in your documentation. Some of what we've seen this year is the first time that the IRS has kicked documents back. I've seen both the 1094s and individual 1095s kicked back to companies because the forms weren't completed correctly. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the codes were all incorrect. Some of it is that you didn't transcribe the individual's name from the top line down to the bottom line. Some of the things were very nominal, but the IRS is very particular. So again, you want to make sure that you have really pristine tracking mechanism to make sure that you know month by month who was or wasn't eligible. Certainly a Ben admin system is preferable in helping to manage that. Oftentimes your benefit broker or third-party administrator, if you have one, can be, again, very instrumental in helping to create the 1095s and 1094 documents for you to review. That certainly is a preference because it is going to continue to become complex as the various types of employment scenarios come up with part-time employees managing an average of 30 work hours to be eligible on an average basis. So you want to make sure you have your measurement period and your administrative periods locked down, and they're utilizing those time frames and putting your eligibility, again, information into the system to track it effectively. So with all that said, the deadline is January 31st. It's coming, and hopefully you are effectively prepared for it. Please feel free to talk to your benefit brokers. They are helpful and subject matter experts in some of that information.
Danielle, a quick question about that.
Yeah.
If a company does submit the forms on time, but they are incomplete, is there a grace period for correcting the form, or if corrections are required after January 31st, are there penalties associated?
Yeah, so there are, certainly if you don't file on time, that's a problem. There are, typically what's happening is the IRS is sending documentation to employers with copies of the incorrect documents indicating that they need repaired and giving them a follow-up deadline for resubmission. So they're recognizing there's a learning curve, and the expectation is that you would resubmit. Some of the ones that I've seen, Walt, only have like 1 or 2 employees. And again, the ones that I've seen have been fairly negligible mistakes. I've had some conversations with some other HR folks where there actually weren't mistakes, that the IRS got it wrong, which has been an interesting dilemma amidst all of it. But certainly, there haven't been penalties assigned at this point for submitting them incorrectly, just the requirement that you have a secondary deadline for resubmitting the ones with errors.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so far. Thank you for your question. I also want to talk a little bit about metric analysis for HR. So, you know, a lot of us have scenarios where it's sometimes hard to show value and contribution to the organization. And I just wanted to talk about a couple of things that I think are really beneficial for HR to be reporting on to your organization. One is turnover numbers. And I mentioned turnover numbers because this has been historically and in the marketplace a distinct concern for a lot of organizations. It's not restricted to one industry, but certainly exacerbated in certain industries. So the idea behind turnover is understanding how many people are leaving your organization. The real metric of turnover doesn't have anything to do with the numbers, but the whys behind it, and that's often found through exit interviews and some other types of tools that HR folks and organizations use. But reality is, just an overall tenure number probably isn't sufficient to be able to really help talk about what's happening within the organization. And I would suggest that an overall turnover number compared to industry benchmark is probably your best bet for talking about how you're trending. You should probably have some goals around that too, and what your turnover is, because sometimes there's healthy turnover and oftentimes there's not. So from a turnover perspective, there's a couple of things in addition to benchmark from an industry perspective that I think is really important for people to look at. One is, what's the turnover for tenured folks? And you can consider tenure, you know, 1 year plus, 2 year plus, and you can set your own threshold for that. The interesting part is if you're having turnover in tenured employees, something's happening that really needs addressed. The second piece is new hire. You know, the cost of turnover is oftentimes calculated out at 1.5 times salary or even more, depending on your organization and industry, and how much training and investment you really need to put in somebody to help them become, you know, viable and from a performance perspective in your organization. So when you look at the cost around that to a company, if you can't hire people and retain them within the first year or two, your costs are skyrocketing. We also hear a lot about specific industries, manufacturing being one of them, that talk about the cost of the transfer of knowledge, which we'll talk a little bit more about. The idea that somebody who's been here for a long time has all this information, and how do you transfer it to somebody else? Well, they have to stick around to be able to do that. So turnover is really critical, and being able to identify turnover from both tenure and new hire, as well as you can report it by department, you can report it by service and function within your organization. My guess is, as HR people and management in general, numbers by specific department or function aren't going to be surprising. Generally speaking, people have a sense of what's happening within the company and if there's issues. Oftentimes they're leadership, oftentimes they're training oriented and onboarding oriented. Sometimes, you know, we promote people because they're the strongest technician into leadership roles and then don't give them all the expertise and knowledge they need to be a successful people leader, and sometimes that's root cause. Sometimes there's issues relative to the tools that we're giving them to be successful in their role. Sometimes it's pay. You know, there's a whole bunch of reasons, but using turnover metrics as a springboard to figure some of those out, or in tandem with exit surveys and information that you know within your organization is power to help from an HR perspective to help address issues, but also if your numbers are better than industry standard or better than the metrics that you established, a great value contribution to your organization. With that said, another great value contribution is staffing analysis. And when you, again, consider the cost of turnover, the cost of replacing, the employment brand you may have in the market, it's really important to fill positions and get people trained quickly. So to the extent that you can analyze the time to fill from the time the position came open to the time that somebody stepped in the door, and again, look at how to reduce that time to fill and specifically identify actions and deliverables that you can implement and partner with production or general operations or sales or whomever the position's for to help mitigate and reduce that time to fill is really significant. And then again, the number of open positions, the number of that were open and closed during the year, again, is a very good metric to provide. I think oftentimes people don't, they lose kind of line, I guess what I'm saying is they lose line of sight to how many positions HR helps to fill. And the last piece is benefit enrollment. And certainly, I don't just necessarily mean the number of people on benefits, that's a cost, but really analyzing and looking at what was your benefit philosophy. Did you offer more than one benefit program with the expectation of driving from a cost reduction to a high deductible HSA, as an example, from a traditional PPO? And did your philosophy pay off, and did it result in that? I would also suggest looking at benefits enrollment year over year from a cost perspective. And did you institute any wellness or other initiatives to help reduce, not just increase enrollment or reduce enrollment, but cost relative to it? There have been a lot of theories that wellness is going to be a great contributor to reduction in medical benefit costs. I don't know that there's anything out there at this point that's really been indicative that that's the case. It certainly seems to be a great employee morale scenario. It also, certainly I've heard stories of how it's impacted individuals. Wellness seems to be a much better contributor from a workers' comp perspective for reduction. So if workers' comp is an issue in your organization, and that's a great metric to kind of manage from a lost time or number of injuries, or again, workers' comp benefit cost reduction, I would throw that in too. But any way that you can, and HR can find a way to show real bottom line business advantages, that's a great thing to do. So that's kind of some of the things to be looking at for 2017. I want to talk about 2018 now, because, you know, as we start embarking, and literally in 15 days, embarking on 2018, it's really important for us to kind of get in front of this. So all of the information that we just talked about helps identify opportunities for improvements, opportunities to create bigger impact for the organization, and things that you can really execute on to, again, create that positive impact. Before we get to some of those HR strategy things, I do want to talk a little bit about compliance. You know, it's always important, no matter what we do, to make sure that we get our T's crossed and our I's dotted, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we have those minimal things, the minimal things that we're responsible for in place. So I would suggest a couple things. One, review your employee personnel files. Make sure that your medical documentation is separate. That includes your benefits enrollment if you're not doing that online, which is a much easier way to do it. But if you are doing paper enrollment forms, they should be kept in a separate employee file. With time off requests, with doctor's notes, all those other things. Your workers' comp files and incidents should be kept in separate files, and your FMLA should be kept in separate files. If that's not the case, a great time to clean that stuff up. And oh, by the way, catch up on outstanding filing, because that always seems to fall at the bottom of the pile because nobody loves filing. but it'll only compound in 2018, so I do recommend making sure that you catch up on any outstanding employee filing, largely because in the event you would get subpoenaed or get audited, you just want to have all that cleaned up. I-9 documentation. It's a great time to go back and look and say, do we have everything that we need? When we onboarded everybody, did they give us their copies of their documentation to prove that they can legitimately work in the United States? Did they go back and make sure that we completed those documentation trails correctly, that you've hit all the boxes and you checked everything, you've signed everything, and you filed the I-9s in a separate I-9 file, one for active employees and one for terminated employees, that they are not in the personnel files. That would be a great thing to just kind of review. I have update postings yet. There are states that regularly make regulatory changes. Nothing significant on a federal level, but there are some state-level changes. So you want to make sure that if you're in a state that has had some changes, you have those. If you don't replace the posters, make sure you print out the state-level documents and just pin them on your board. They do have to be hard copy posted in an area that's accessible to all your employees. I would also suggest relative to that, if you have new hire documentation that's state specific, I would make sure that you have all of the current versions. There have been some things that have changed. I can use California as an example as of 1/1/18, that you're going to need to make sure you have the most recent versions of the forms. So if you have not done that, please make sure you go out and verify that you have all of the most recent pieces. And it's pretty easy to find on your labor and industry or labor webpage for your relevant state. Handbook. A lot of times companies make policy changes and add supplemental policies and have employees sign off on the policies and don't incorporate it into their handbook. Whether you do incorporate it or you have them separate, I think it's a great opportunity just to look and say, are the policies that we have and is the handbook that we have in the manner that it's written, does it meet the expectations of how we execute on policies? So the reality is, even if you have it written in a policy, if your practice is different, practice supersedes policy. So you do want to just make sure that you're taking a gander at the way the handbook is documented and ensuring that you have it all reflected accurately and appropriately in your handbook, or you create some new policies and you have everybody sign off as an addendum. And then lastly, in the event you have offer letters and employment agreements, you want to make sure that everything gets updated to 2018. If there's any language that is old-fashioned or you're not using anymore, again, policies that change with PTO requirements or et cetera, that you're getting all of those documents updated and templated, although templates can be edited, but you're getting it templated so that you have a great baseline to start from each time you that you make an offer or you have to extend an employment agreement. So I do want to talk a little bit about HR strategy. We talked a little bit about addressing turnover and retention. It's really important because, again, the cost of doing that you are coming up with strategy that works for your organization and thinking about not just 2018 but beyond. So the idea is two things. One, what can we implement near term that will make an impact? And then longer term, what would this look like if we can make some improvements? There's a couple of things that are at play that is really underlying to a lot of what we're going to talk about here with HR strategy. One, what's the life cycle of your business? Are you in growth mode? Are you a startup? Are you a very experienced company that is just kind of plugging along? Depending on what your corporate strategy is over the next 3 to 5 years really depends on some of the things that you need to do. Unfortunately, turnover and retention tends to be a very immediate and has an immediate impact, which is great. But again, from a longer-term perspective, solving the problem today, but not looking at how you're affected as an organization tomorrow can be really damaging, largely because, first of all, I know you can't 100% predict what's going to happen 2 years from now, but if you know you're in growth mode and you need to hire 10 production workers today, but really you're going to need to be able to retain and increase that to 30 over 3 years. What are you doing to chip away at that so you meet the organization's needs from a production perspective? You need to be anticipating retirements and what that means, so not just growth, but what anticipated turnover do you have, and how are you creating a pipeline and getting in front of that from a recruiting perspective? They're never available when you need them. They're just not. And if you're in a reactive mode, you're always going to have these job openings. But if you can get in front of it and be able to anticipate it and have a pipeline of candidates, even if it's a short-term pipeline, you're going to be much better off to be able to address those business needs. Talk to your operations folks, talk to your financial folks, and understand what the workforce strategy is, and make sure that you understand from a planning perspective. Even better, be involved in the workforce. You should have your HR people involved with the workforce planning to make sure that they know how to execute and support those initiatives. Performance management. It is a great tool to document what's transpired. And in the event that there's a disciplinary or performance issue, that you have something written down to help support whatever employment determination that you make, whether it's to terminate, suspend, demote, whatever. It's also a great tool to be able to help you meet the strategy of the organization. So if you are trying to grow, you want people who are going to grow with you. Just having a 12-month look-back evaluation without a how are we setting goals and how can we help you align to our needs and evolve people to management from a succession perspective, from a cross-training, being able to utilize that tool to help motivate people is probably even more meaningful and valuable than just creating the documentation. It can really support both pieces. What I would suggest is that it's time to evaluate your performance management system and determine if it's meeting essentially the needs and goals of the organization, and have those needs and goals changed, and have you altered your system? My guess is no. This is definitely one of those processes that HR issues, we beg or beat people up to return them timely, and sometimes there's not value add unless it's a negative scenario. I'm suggesting there's a lot of value add in a positive scenario, again, to motivate, to align compensation better to performance and reward people, and again, have people really be aligned to the strategy. So I think that's a great opportunity for HR at this point in the year, saying, I want to understand what our business goals are and how can we use performance management. There's a lot of discussion right now around continuous feedback, and really what that is exactly what I talked about. How do you get people feedback so that you can reinforce positive behavior, redirect behavior that's not going in the direction you need to, and support the overall business strategy. That doesn't mean you don't review people and let them know how they've been doing, but how do you partner that or match that with continuous feedback that helps drive performance and really have it be a proactive approach to performance management. Succession and cross-training was kind of mentioned in all of that, but really looking at if you have an aging workforce, how are you managing this? You're going to have to figure out how to hire millennials. You're going to have to figure out how to get some of that knowledge base that these people who eventually are going to retire and not be with you have in their head. And some of that could be, from a millennial perspective, looking at cross-training folks. Not just having them just do the role that they're doing, but how do you give them new opportunity and compensation aligned to it to keep them motivated? You may need to teach them a new trick. And what that timing looks like and how to structure that can look very different in every organization. Oftentimes in this succession and cross-training piece, we also are talking about management succession and making sure we're positioning the next level leadership. I would suggest this is a good time to be looking at who are those high potentials, what does 5 to 7 years look like for them potentially, and how do you start aligning them to internal mentors and role models to help get them some of the experiences, align them to projects and initiatives, get them involved in corporate strategic planning, pull them into whatever you can so that you're starting to create that loyalty and connectivity to the organization at a level beyond just coming in every day and doing the job. Staffing and headcount, again, that really comes down to making sure we have a workforce plan and being able to manage to the expectation. And then lastly, relative to it is HR strategy, you need to be looking at technology and what can technology do to help make your life easier. It's about working smarter, not harder, and technology can do a lot to help us streamline and create a lot of efficiency in what we do. You know, the reality is we talked a little bit about Affordable Care Act and, you know, having a really strong ben admin system where you can design your benefit eligibility and report on some of this information. Some of them even let you track your Affordable Care Act codes right in there. It feeds from your HRIS system, which is tracking all of your full-time equivalency data. It's really important to have something because, again, we've got to work smarter, not harder. And if we're not positioning ourselves now, we're already behind technology. What does it look like 3 to 5 years from now when it's exceeded that much further from where we are? So that would be something from an HR strategy perspective to start thinking, what can I do? And oh, by the way, not just for HR, but what can we put in place that's going to help make our managers and line supervisors' jobs easier than what they are today? Again, all we can save is time, and time is money. So,
Danielle, if some of the customers have questions about the tools or making recommendations of a performance management system, do we have some tools and systems that we can recommend based on their company size and requirements?
Yeah, so I have, yes, absolutely. I've seen a variety of tools. You know, some of them, depending on what the goals of the organization are and what they're trying to accomplish, some of them are going to be better than others. But absolutely, there are, and there's technology for performance management, for recruiting and applicant tracking, for benefits administration, for succession planning and career development, for compensation. So there's tools that really cover the gamut of things that both managers and HR would get involved in to help support the organization.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. All right, so last thing, I just wanted to kind of highlight a reporting change for anybody who may not know. So the EEO-1 report has traditionally been filed at the end of September. So any employer with more than 100 employees or federal contractors with more than 50 employees are required to file this. It is an EEOC requirement. What it does is have you report on race, ethnicity, and gender for all of your employees within your organization by job category. So you can report on managers, you can report on production line workers, you can report on sales. The goal behind this is being accountable for reporting minority and female utilization and within your organization. It had been determined that it would be delayed from September to March because there had been an EEOC and DOL, Department of Labor initiative, that we were also going to have to report wage information. And, you know, again, my estimation on that is largely to look at unfair wage and labor practices for female and minorities in workplaces. Trump came in and kiboshed that, so while you do not have to provide wage information as of March 31st, we do still have to provide all of the rest of the information, so it continues to be delayed. Again, it's coming at the end of March. It's an online tool. It's a little bit more complicated than the paper forms in the past, but you can log right in and you're set up a company code and complete all of the data requirements right online. It actually requires, what they're requiring is that you pull a payroll record from October, November, December, and there's instructions on the website link that I provide here in the email and the slides, sorry. It's just a good piece of information to have. If you didn't know that you missed it in September, I don't want you to miss it in March. So that would
Danielle,
be...
this form looks pretty intimidating. I mean, there's a lot of different job descriptions. Have they simplified this by the type of company that you might be?
No, which is why it gets to be kind of complex. So the good news is, okay, so the bad news is it is much more complex. The good news is because it's online, there's a lot more data as to how to fill it out than there was before when it was a paper form. So it's not specified by industry, and all of the classifications, again, like first-line production workers, first-line workers, those are generic in nature, and the best case scenario is you really ought to look at what you've filed in the past and see how you've classified people, because if all of a sudden you're reclassifying a lot of folks, it doesn't mean that it's wrong, it means that you may have misclassified in the past. But there is a lot more resources online. You should go in, as Walt did, and look at some of the information. There's some frequently asked questions. There's some additional data that the EEOC has provided to help with clarity. And I would just say, when in doubt, ask.
Great.
And that's all I have.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. For those of you that are interested, we will have additional webinar topics dedicated specifically to HR and HR-related updates throughout 2018. If you have any questions or comments in the meantime, feel free to send them directly to your account manager. For those of you that don't know, Gia Lane manages all of our East Coast accounts in the Central and Eastern time zone, and Mike Scher is our West Coast manager managing customers in our Pacific and Mountain time zone. On behalf of everybody here at RKL, we want to thank you for your time, for your attention, and wish you a happy holidays. This will conclude today's session. Thank you.